Main agenda. Okay, hello folks. It's good to be back at the Trebuchet call. I do wish I could make it more often, but I have conflicts. But I'm here today to talk to you about payer data exchange, specifically about something we are incorporating into PDex STU 2.2. I have just gone through this week with financial management to add to go for an STU2 unballoted update, so that it's one of those processes where we'll have a 2-week review of the things that have been added. And what has been added in that version PDex is primarily the provider access version 2. And what I'm going to go through today on the call here is really the differences and the approach, and maybe go into some of the background behind this. So with that, as people know, I'm both the author of PDex as well as running the PDex work group. So let me start with the bulk APIs. These were introduced in PDex 2.1, and there are really two APIs. There is a payer-to-payer bulk API, and there is the provider access bulk API. Largely the same, in fact, using the same data export process. It's the Da Vinci data export that was actually originally defined in the Da Vinci attribution IG by Dragon, my colleague, and is very much aligned with the prior export operation. It's just that we actually, in that Da Vinci data export, we actually make the various parameters required rather than optional for the servers to implement. So in those bulk APIs, you basically will have, when retrieving data, you can potentially have US core clinical data. So we're now in 2026, so that would be version 6.1 or US CDI version 3. You would have the Karen Blue Button 2.1 financial claims, but without the financials. So think of it, all the monies have dropped. So you would know for inpatient, outpatient, professional, vision, dental, you'd know who did what, when to whom, when, where, but not how much, right? So it provides a fair bit of information. It's a redacted version. If you look in that guide, you're looking for the basis profiles. And then payer data exchange, we added the prior authorization. So the prior authorization is another variation of explanation of benefit, and it obviously follows it has also the supporting clinical data that goes into the decision. So again, you will have largely structured clinical data that was asked for in the process of prior authorization. And we are basically taking the data from the prior authorization support claim response and translating it into an EOB. It goes back to some of the history of the EOB as a design of both claim and claim response formats. And so we've incorporated the extensions that you would find in prior auth support are also there in the PDex prior authorization EOB. There is a difference, though, between payer-to-payer and provider. It's you could say slightly esoteric, and that's payer-to-payer also has a requirement for any unstructured data used in the course of determining a prior authorization needs to also be incorporated. So that doesn't mean you have to do all the translation into an AI to try and convert a chart, a handwritten chart, into, for example, an observation or an encounter or whatever. Basically means if you've received, for example, a digital image, a digital fax, you would basically base64 encode it and incorporate it with a document reference, so it can be exchanged via effectively the US core suite of APIs. Also, the payer-to-payer limits the amount of data to 5 years from the date of the request. there isn't that same requirement in provider access. So provider access can receive potentially all of the data that you might have that a patient might have asked for through the patient access API. But in terms of the prior authorizations, they're only going to get the supported structured clinical data. Okay, so the export operation itself is basically the same between these two APIs. And the way payer-to-payer works is that a new payer, I'll talk in terms of new and old payer, the new payer will have the member opt in, so therefore they will provide the prior coverage information, the demographics, i.e. patient record, and an authorization using the consent resource. That's submitted to the old payer, who will go through their roles, take that information and say, do they match? If they do, great, let's put them into a matched group. If they don't, I'll tell you that they don't match. And if the way the consent is structured, I can't comply, for example, I cannot separate out sensitive from unsensitive, I'm going to send back a consent constraint saying, sorry, I can't. Payers will want to fail safe, okay? That matched group that's created, that is used as the base for then doing a Da Vinci data export, okay? So that's important to understand. That's how payer-to-payer works. So in developing provider access version 2, we'll come back to that. So how does provider access version 1? We've not removed that from the IG at this stage, although we would encourage anybody to implement version 2. There are certain instances where version 1 may be useful, for example, where you want to, as a payer, want to exchange information to allow a provider to pull data, say, for a fixed value-based contract, value-based care contract, where there is a set of individuals, of members. So provider access, the way this was originally designed in version 1, is you would typically take things like the claims history and use that as the basis of saying, is there a treatment relationship between the provider and the payer? So have I received a claim more than... And the actual structure of that, how far you're going to look back, how many claims, all of these things were really left to the payer to use their own business rules to come up with what is effectively, and I know it's a loaded term, an attribution list. Okay, that attribution list, whereas BBC contracts may be very fixed, is actually dynamic. I am taking new members on, I may be losing members. The member, remember, in provider access is automatically opted in, but they have the option of saying, no, I do not want to share my data. So the payer has to check whether there have been any opt-outs in producing the actual attribution list. They could also choose to use other triggers, such as we suggest. We don't require, but as we suggest in the IG, you could, for example, use the CRD appointment book or the encounter start hook as saying, here's an indication of an impending treatment relationship, and therefore update the list so that the provider can then come in and make a request. Now, what this requires is that the payer generates these lists for every one of their in-network or providers with which they have some sort of contractual relationship. And that list is used to actually then come in. So it's a group resource. The provider comes in and through that group list runs a Da Vinci data export, where you can actually ask for a subset of the members in the list. You can do a number of things. You can set a time window for the data you want to look at. You can say which resources you want. You can say even think of it as what fire search criteria you want to apply against those resources. So you can, if you want, be very specific about the data you're retrieving. So that was done so that providers weren't being forced to take a fire hose of data from the payer because there are obviously potential liability issues there. So the issue with this in theory works fine, but the feedback we got from a number of payers is that this is an onerous thing to actually manage in terms of managing those lists and putting data members in and out of those lists. And also, many payers are saying we want to be relatively permissive about that attribution. And so we're generating very large lists. So some of the national payers are saying, I could have providers with, particularly if I'm dealing with, say, a practice of tens of thousands of members. Well, if you think, then what's the default action in the data export? If someone doesn't do anything and just says, I want a data export, it basically says, give me everything for everyone. Now, that's when you're talking about attribution lists where you could have tens of thousands of members. That's almost like a denial of service attack on your Fire API. And also, there's the question of how you deal with people that are being added to the list. How do you know about new patients and so forth? So it had, in simple terms, it could work, but it had some risks associated. So we basically went back to the drawing board and say, how could we do this differently? So what we did is we basically took the payer-to-payer process, so utilizing the same idea of the same bundle, where instead of providing the prior coverage, you would provide the current coverage. So the provider would, for each member they're interested in, provide their current coverage. Think of it as the information on the coverage card. The demographics, because for some coverage may have a subscriber ID and not have an individual member ID for each member that is covered by that coverage. So you need the demographics to be able to identify, as a case of my insurance for myself and my wife, it has the same basically member ID or subscriber ID, and it's just our names are different. There's a lot of other things that are different, but that's, you need the demographics to do that. And then because we're talking covered entity to covered entity, provider to payer, it just felt right to say, let the provider actually include effectively a standard attestation that they have or will have a treatment relationship with this member. So it's somewhat of a commitment that they're saying, yes, I do have a relationship. This is not requiring the provider to go back and have the patient sign anything and submit that. That's then got to be a wet signature that is included. It's simply a pro forma attestation, again, represented as a consent resource. That basically goes into a member match function, just like payer to payer, where you're either going to say, yes, I match, this member matches, they haven't opted out. There could be other business rules that the payer is applying to say, yes, I agree there's a treatment relationship. Otherwise, there will be effectively a not matched or a consent constraint group. The opted out group is really the consent constraint. So the only resource that really needs to be instantiated in the server is the matched group. Now, what this does is it really fits as the feedback we received, is it's much more closely aligned with the provider's mode of operation. That, think of it as, here's the inquiry, here's a list of the members I'm seeing tomorrow or I'm seeing this week. So you have a limited number of members that are instantiated into that matched group. And when the provider now, when they receive back the identifier for that group and make a call through that matched group, they're basically saying, give me, by default, give me everything for this group of members that I'm interested in. Now, that is likely to be a far smaller group. It may be 10, 20 members rather than potentially thousands of members. So it's much more targeted. And it allows particular business rules to be applied. One very good example that we've talked through with some of the connectathons around this is, you could, as a payer, have a new provider that has come on board. You don't know much about them. And so you may say, I'll release information to this provider once I've actually seen that there are claims coming in for the particular member for that provider. And that's fine. Again, the rules are really down to what the business is comfortable with. And then you might take another example. Maybe they have a provider or a practice that they effectively, if you want to use the term gold star, they're basically saying, you know, this provider, this practice carries out their business in such a way I don't try and second guess them. They're excellent at what they do. And so in that scenario, when a member presents to that provider and the provider says, you know, for example, books them in for an appointment, and if they were to submit them on this list of here's the members I'm interested in, the payer may have a business rule that says gold carded providers assume the treatment relationship is correct, that the provider is stating. So it actually potentially deals with a number of different, more of the edge cases. It's also of particular relevance, I think, to the blues. And what can happen there is you can have a member who is on a plan in one state, but they live in another state, and therefore the providers in that state are not necessarily in network with the plan that they are homed with. And so the only person that really knows who's in the provider's roster is the provider. And so this allows the provider to submit the list to their local plan, and the local plan can sort out to send information across the Blues network to get to the actual home plan of the member, run the same rules internally, and send back to the host plan that received the request whether the member can be included or not. So it provides much more flexibility, but it also, I think, reduces the risk of, let's say, abuse of these bulk APIs. So it actually is more geared towards give me information about the members I am actually interested in, not just everybody that is assigned to me. So that is really the change. So what it comes down to is that the export operation is unchanged. All we've done is saying there is a different method to arrive at the group resource you're going to use to make that query. And it's much safer to then say, you can just do a data export against that group because it's going to be a more contained group. So what we have, how do payers determine that response? So is the provider in network? Are they known, or do they have some sort of contractual relationship? There is the question of, has the member opted out? Now that again is an easier thing to maintain, because with members by default being opted in, there's probably going to be a lot fewer members that have actually opted out. So you can manage that. And the way we've written the API, the implementation guide, is to say, if you're a payer, if you have systems to, for example, determine whether, say in your compliance system, you can determine whether a member is opted out or not, or maybe you have a billing system, whatever, that is maintaining the treatment relationships. If you have those, you can use those in your member match function. You don't have to export all that data and create these frequently changing group resources. So it becomes easier for implementers to choose the right implementation model. We certainly provide the models for creating the appropriate groups, but we're not requiring them to be used as such. So member opt-out is one of those checks. And then, is there a treatment relationship? And as the examples I've given, could be different rules that the payers apply. And we have had, in conversations in our PDex community calls, some people saying, well, I might want to take the X12 eligibility check as an indication. Other people saying, no, I wouldn't do that, but I want to take the CDS hooks in prior authorization and use those as a trigger. And so we're not trying to get into this is the set of rules that you have to operate, but we try to provide the structure of saying when you've made that decision about the treatment relationship, this is how you'll express it. So as I say, in this process, the only group that really needs to be instantiated in the Fire API or the Firestore is that matched group. And we've actually proposed that maybe those should only be maintained for like 30 days so that typically a provider will come in, make us a new match request, get back a new dynamic group, and off they go then requesting that the actual export against that group. Say payers can use existing systems to make the determinations in creating that matched group. And as we said before, it also in the feedback we've received through the community calls is this does more closely align with the way providers would prefer to work around the workflows that they're operating. And as I've indicated, it reduces the risk of high volume API requests for these bulk APIs. So that very quickly, I've run through in about 25 minutes. Happy to take any questions on all of this.
Thanks, Mark. Excellent presentation. I'll open it up to the group for questions. Anyone have any questions for Mark?
Hey, Mark, this is
No.
Oh,
yeah.
Go
ahead.
Okay, great. So just curious, have any of the electronic health records companies looked at the new spec, and is there alignment with what they're able to support?
I have not reached out directly to those EHR vendors. It's probably something we should do. But yeah, we'll have to see how this is actually going to be adopted. But it certainly fits with the potential workflows that providers are following.
Okay, so potential next step there, or probably a necessary next. And then you kind of touched on what I was going to ask next, which is what is sort of the expectation for the path to getting this approved, validated, adopted?
Yeah. So where I'm at with that is there is an unballoted STU update process. I've made the case that we're basically taking content that's already in the IG and sort of restructuring it. So the actual export operation in provider access is unchanged. What we're changing is the way that you construct the group that you use to perform the export through. And that's modeled on what is already in play in PDex in payer-to-payer. It follows the same sort of logic. So where we're at is FM signed off this Tuesday on this update process. So now I have to go through FMG, TSC. The CI build version 2 is pretty well clean in terms of the QA. So we're really at a point that we can, I think, very quickly move to doing a 2-week review and then going through to publication. So I'm really, obviously next week is HIMSS. Hopefully I'll see a lot of you there. I do not have any expectations of being able to get through FMG and TSC next week, but I would be looking to do that the following week and then start really getting into having a formal 2-week review. So we're really looking probably realistically towards the end of April. But hopefully the CI build is in a pretty hopefully consistent state.
Okay, awesome. And then one more question. So is this like backwards compatible? I don't know if that's the right terminology for this, but if one implementer is V1 and the other one is V2, does that work together?
Well, like I say, the actual export operation is unchanged. So if you are granting permission to a provider to be able to search against the group resources, and then be able to do a data export query, that is completely unchanged, right? The process, we're really trying to encourage people, and I personally see probably a lot more movement towards making, yes, using bulk queries, but being more focused around what I'd term active members or active patients. And so we really, I think, want to see the version 2, it's really just the, how do I tell you which members I'm interested in, right, is the piece that we really want people to adopt. We've had feedback that's saying, can we use the PDex version 1, for example, because on like an annual or a quarterly basis, providers that are in VBC arrangements want to do a big pull of data, right? And so the version 1 is actually good for that. If you've got the group ID for that value-based care contract, yes, you've got the appropriate permissions in terms of authentication authorization, that you'd then be able to use version 1 to pull all of that data.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Hey there, this is Alec from Blue Cross Kansas City.
Hi, Alex.
Okay. I joined a little bit late, but I saw that provider attestation V1 a little bit, and I kind of caught the tail end of the claims discussion. And then you went into the V2 one.
Yeah.
I saw the demographics block there, and then the member coverage. The coverage obviously makes sense, but for the demographics, does that follow the payer-to-payer demographics? Or?
Yeah, it's actually both payer-to-payer and provider access in terms of the version 2, in terms of the patient demographics, actually follows the definitions done for the patient profile in the HREX guide. So it's consistent with everything done in single member match and so forth. So the HREX patient profile really relaxed some of the constraints, because if you think about it, from whilst the payer may have a detailed record, somebody submitting a query, as for example another payer or a provider, they don't necessarily know all of the details, like the system of record for that number or whatever. So it was designed to basically support a patient, basically a matching query. But it is consistent across really now about 4 different implementations: HREX, member match, PDex single member match, PDex payer-to-payer bulk member match, and now provider access member match. One of the things we've tried to do I think across a lot of Da Vinci, is do something once and, try and allow reuse.
Got you. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Mark, can you talk a bit more about the attestation of the treatment relationship? Are you kind of inferring that the payer doesn't necessarily need to validate it on their own, as if they have that? You think you get that from the provider?
Yeah, if you go back to, if I can take a step back to payer-to-payer, right? There is a consent in payer-to-payer. It doesn't require a wet signature from the member. It was really designed more as a fact that you as the payer that were going to be asked to release information would have something of record that said the member agreed to this, right? The idea being that if you suspected that other payer was a bad actor, I'm not saying there aren't any of those, then you would have the ability to basically say, I want to go audit what you've done, all of these requests, but how many of them are legit? Show me where you got that attestation from, etc. Right? So it's sort of supporting an out-of-band audit, let's say, right? it just felt right with what we're dealing with two covered entities, provider and payer, that it just made sense that, my naive mind, to have the provider basically say, yes, I am having a treatment relationship with this member. Because again, you would have, effectively, it provides material so that if the payer had some suspicions about, really, is that legitimate? Again, you could effectively have documentation for an out-of-band audit.
Okay.
That was
Yeah,
really all it was trying to do. We weren't
Mhm.
trying to impose that the provider's now got to go and get us as patients to sign yet another piece of paper in 8-point type we can't read, right? It's really there as just recording that the provider is making an attestation.
Yeah. All right, makes sense.
Yeah.
And when this is published, would it be considered mandatory, or just one of the options for provider access?
The consent would actually be required.
No, I'm sorry, not consent, but just the version 2.
At this stage, obviously, there's a lot of discussions going on around, because we're getting so close to the deadline for the mandate. What are people already developing? The way I've tried to write this in the 2.2 version is, really, I would recommend payers implement version 2. That we don't do, if you're starting out to implement anything now, don't do version 1, do version 2.
Right.
And I think what we'll have to do over time is how do we change the conformance language as we move forward? I had a similar issue in payer to payer in single member match, where the regulation required a bulk process. We'd already published a single member match capability, and there was a big discussion about how do we remove that. But there had already been we had feedback that there had already been some payers in, primarily, I think, California, that had already implemented against that. So we didn't actually rip it out. We've left it in there. And I'm currently going through, I've been having discussions around, is there still a value in having that single member match function? Because it could fit very nicely into the sort of interactive signing up process for a new member, to just check, have they given us the right information? And actually maybe separating out that member match, the single member match, from the actual retrieval of data. Should that, for example, request go into a group that could then be run as a batch process later, for example. So I think we'll see some further evolution around all of these APIs as we get real implementation experience.
All right, sounds good.
Mark, that's something that's come up when we've been discussing how to set expectations for developing towards V1 or V2, and just understanding what our provider partners are going to be able to transact with.
Yeah.
And so I know there's no HTI reference for a required certification criteria for PDex. But assuming this gets balloted and is sort of the preferred approach, are there conformance capability statement type things that EHRs would be able to certify against, that we could, make a plug to have this be referenced in an upcoming rule like HTI, or whether they build towards V1 or V2, is like an impact our plan's ability to transact with their providers?
Yeah. I think part of what we need to do, I think ultimately we do need to have the ability to test and certify these APIs, so that there is consistency. I think the first step is just if you look at what we're trying to accomplish with version 2, it's really trying to avoid the need for, let's say, unnecessary processing. Let's say that if you go back to when I opened this up, the default action, if you don't provide any additional query parameter constraints, is give me everything about everyone. And if that's going to, cause the payer to have to go and run processes for days to be able to compile an enormous list, and then when it's then retrieved by the provider, they've got to go through to actually filter out the information about the members they really wanted. It just makes so much sense, I think, for everyone to think about this move towards, let's be asking for data about the patients that we're actively interested in. I think there are enormous economy benefits for both parties in being more precise about who you're interested in.
Okay, so it sounds like we just need to get on the same page with the
Yeah,
HR
I
side of
think
the world.
so.
Yep.
Yeah. And don't forget, we'll be having, there's the US Realm Connectathon. I'd love to see if we can even do some initial testing against this. So we'll be having a Connectathon track kickoff on the 13th in our regular Friday 1 p.m. Eastern call. So love people to sign up and see if we can get testing going.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm going to drop a link to the PDex Connectathon kickoff call information in the chat in just a minute. Are you able to also share the slides so I can include those?
Yeah, I'll shoot them across to you, Casey.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording real quick.
Okay. And I can stop sharing for